Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to Connect Africa and welcome to our daily streaming session here where we bring you issues that are happening in the continent and outside the continent that impacts Africa and its people. And we give it a Pan-African perspective. So we are here tonight to look at the just ended the African Climate Summit, which was held in Nairobi in the beginning of this week. We're going to look at what are, what came
Last
out
week,
last
it was
week.
last week,
Yeah,
Mahlet.
it was not just ended, but yeah. So we are going to look at the overview, what resolution came out of this meeting, what were the strong points, the weaknesses, if there is any. And for that, we have Kwame Gonza with us. Welcome, Kwame.
Thank you, Mahlet. Thank you so much. And regards to everyone who's watching us, we appreciate that you are with us and you're supporting the channel. That really means a lot to us, and we don't take it for granted. So we want to thank you for supporting the channel. That is very important for us as an African channel, which is trying to present Africa in a more favorable image, because we have been receiving very negative image from the rest of the world, majority of the world. Of course, there is those who have been painting Africa in a more favorable image, like the channels in the eastern part of the world, but the western part of the world, those even who say that they are Africa's friends, and therefore they are at the forefront of establishing NGOs to give Africa aid, are always, consistently, they have consistently presented Africa in a very negative image. And of course, because it benefits them, we know that the aid industry in itself is being used to feed themselves, who present Africa as a basket case. And so our channel is here just to, put the record straight. That is what we are here to do. And this is the very reason, if you are an African and you are a friend of Africa, all over across the globe, we are, enemy. We are an enemy to none. So we want to look at the Africa Climate Summit, which happened in Nairobi a week ago, before the G20 summit, to which the African Union was admitted. And we've spoken about this already. We have done a video on this. We have done an analysis. You can go out in the live videos, which we have done on this channel, Connect Africa. Check anywhere, and you will see that video, which we have done on the G20. But before that, also, there was the BRICS Summit. This year has been filled with a lot of events. So there was a G20 Summit. There was also the BRICS Summit before the Africa Climate Summit in Nairobi. So the BRICS Summit also, we did it. We did an analysis on it, and it's extensive. You need to watch it because there is a lot of information we have packed in that video. Actually, it is quite long, but it is because there is so much information that is packed in there. The summit was about 3 days, and even covering it for 2 hours is not enough. We can only touch, just little bits of it, because this is a summit which happened for 3 consecutive days. So it's the same thing which the Nairobi Africa Climate Summit did, that it took almost 3 days. So there was a lot that happened. So in this channel, we can only do the highlights and the most important parts of it. That is what we want to touch on. So Mahlet, let me give this back to you so that you can take on our viewers. Thank you so much, everyone who's watching us, and we really appreciate you for being part of this channel.
Yeah, thank you, Kwame, for that, for reminding our viewers here what we have done in terms of analyzing summits that impact the continent. Now, so this month, one of the biggest event of the month was, of course, the African Climate Summit, and then followed by the G20. So in the African Climate Summit, we have seen heads of states, meaning the participants. There were heads of states, there were professionals, practitioners, there were policymakers, civil society organizations, international organizations like the UN and continental bodies like the AU and the European Union and the African Union, and individuals as well. Just give us an overview and the resolutions that came out of this summit that was convened in the Eastern African country in Nairobi, in the capital city.
Thank you very much, Mahlet. Actually, the resolution, before I go to the Africa Climate Summit in Nairobi, I would like to touch or a little bit on the G20 summit a little bit. I want to go back a little bit because what happened at the G20, actually, the resolutions are not very different from what happened at the Africa Climate Summit. That the voice that was being amplified in all these summits was the global South, the voice of the global South, and how the current global order, and actually is the same. The resolutions still look the same as what happened at the BRICS summit. They are very related, not exactly the same, but they are very related in one way or the other. I remember we mentioned how we did the analysis on the G20. One of the things which we spoke about, Mahlet, was that India has emerged as a global power, or is trying to position itself as a global power. And I know we've been a little bit, at least maybe in some way we've looked a little bit critical in some ways when India was making certain moves, because we thought that it was trying to sabotage, the BRICS summit when the BRICS summit was about to happen. But it turned out India was not doing that actually. And we want to send actually our greetings and shout outs to our Indian fans who are, out there. We want to encourage you to share the channel and invite other people. We see that India has really become a global player. Of course, not to the extent of the United States and China, not to the extent of China, but at least it has started causing a lot of fear, even in the West itself. I read from certain news, platforms which are from the West, CNBC, of course, and all the other, platforms. And they were talking about India, actually, how it presented itself. And they were actually asking whether India would be a reliable partner with its superpower ambitions. After this was exactly after the summit. This is when they were talking about this, that India is it trying to show its superpower ambitions, so is it trying to present itself as a superpower? And how far would India go with its superpower ambitions? So you see that it is trying to the West is trying to show that, the West is trying to show that it is fearful of the emerging global order, that everyone now wants a share of the power that the West has coveted for a long period of time, because of the way the global South has been able to come together and speak with one voice. And even this has been demonstrated on at majority of the summits that have happened. And that is why I've spoken about the BRICS summit that happened in South Africa, and then the Africa Climate Summit that happened in Nairobi, and then the G20 summit. You see that the resolutions are almost similar. They are quite similar. So that then takes us to the Africa Climate Summit. But I just wanted to remove that from the way that our analysis previously about the G20 summit, which India successfully hosted, I think was quite close to the expectations from, if you look at what the Western media is saying and is talking about India. Now, the Africa Climate Summit, which happened between the 4th and 6th of September, which was last week, was a successful one by all means. But like you said, there is certain issues as Africans, because we are looking at things from a Pan-African perspective. There is things which we thought still that they could have been done better. But many leaders are attended, especially from Africa, from the African continent. Others, they came from the Middle East. We saw leaders from the United Arab Emirates, the president, and from the United Arab Emirates, the former president of the former Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, also was around. The Secretary General himself was around of the United Nations. Even he had a press conference at this particular summit. The envoy, Joe Biden's envoy on climate change, who is John Kerry, of course, also was available. And then it came to the hosts, President Ruto. Of course, he did a great job of inviting the African leaders. Many of them were around. President Kagame was around. Samia Suluhu from Tanzania, she was around. We saw, because the summit also, it was hosted between the government of Kenya, since President Ruto is the current chairperson on climate change, the head of state, the chairperson of the heads of state on climate change at the African Union. So he co-hosted it with the African Union chairperson, who is the Musa Faki, the chairperson of the African Union Commission. President Salva Kiir was around. Also, South Sudan. We had the president of Ethiopia, Mahlet, her. She was around. The president of Sierra Leone, Bayo Susungweso from Congo Brazzaville. He was around. Also, Macky Sall, he was around. Djibouti president was around. A lot of African leaders actually were around. Nana Addo from Ghana also attended the summit. President Nyusu from Mozambique, he was around. The president of Libya was around also. We saw also Sierra Leonean president, was around all the way from West Africa, and Nigeria sent a representative. We saw also that Egypt too sent a representative. The president of the European, the chairperson or president of the European Union Commission, von der Leyen, also was around. She came to give her speech. And of course, the chairperson of the African Union, who is President Assoumani, and the president of the Union of Comoros, who is the current chairperson of the African Union, was also around. So, it was fully packed. It was fully packed. And of course, the youth were around. On the first day, the president of Kenya, who is President William Ruto, hosted the summit, the opening of the summit, together with the president of the African Development Bank, who was around also. I did not mention him, but he was around. The president of the African Development Bank, Adesina, he was around. They hosted it together and spoke to the youth to try to hear what the youth think about this summit and their expectations. And of course, there were a group of youth from all across the continent, Mauritius, Morocco, all the way from West Africa, all over South Africa, Central Africa. All of them, were around to present what they think. So in the all, it was an inclusive summit that all groups were represented. Indigenous people, there was a group which represented African civil society, and then there's a group. So each of them, when the summit opened, were given space to speak. Aside the opening sessions, which belonged to the youth alone, when the summit opened, officially, when all the international delegates and the presidents from the African continent were around, each of the groups were given a chance to speak and present their concern. People like the indigenous people, of course, presented their concerns that, for example, you normally bring development projects and you take over the land which belongs to the indigenous people, like we saw, for example, with the Maasai in Tanzania. There was that concern that Arabs came in and they removed the Maasai from their land, which it have been they have been occupying for centuries and centuries, and they remove them from the land that they want to bring development projects. So this was the ultimate concern, the major concern of the indigenous people who represented the indigenous people of Africa, that their concerns, their grievances need to be, addressed when they are talking about development projects in line with the climate change. If you are talking about renewable energy, for example, you're building dams, you are building solar farms, or you are building wind farms, wind turbine farms, which will generate this renewable energy, or even you are building nuclear power plants, you need to take into consideration their worship places, because some of these indigenous people, they have these places as they are worshiping, places where some of their ancestors, or some of our ancestors, I would say some of our ancestors were buried. So for us as indigenous people, in some cases, these places are sacred for us. So these things need to be noted. And of course, the youth, we're talking about jobs, the importance of jobs, that these development projects need to come. And we are talking about, of course, renewable energy, but we cannot, forget the fact that we have to take care of the provision of jobs for the jobless youth, who are the majority. Right now, the literacy rate is almost coming to 80%, 75 to 80%. But majority of the youth right now are unemployed. So when you are considering the investment in the renewable energy, then you need to consider the youth, and don't just phase out, for example, the sources of energy that you are saying are not renewable, or the fossil fuels, without creating space where these youth are going to work. In cases, for example, we've been speaking about coal. The Europeans have been very much against coal, and I heard even President Macron speaking about coal, that we should phase out the use of coal, when he was speaking at the G20 summit. But what we have realized is that the Europeans have been actually importing coal from South Africa and sending it to Europe, while at the same time talking about the use of coal, that we should not use coal. And so Africa should not use coal, but we see them that they are using this coal. So this is the contradiction in the double speaking or double talk that Europeans and the Western world has when it comes to Africa's development. So it becomes more evident that Africa is being blackmailed purposely, because they do not want Africa to develop, since they see the resources in Africa as belonging to them. They feel entitled to Africa's resources for their industrialization. And we have seen this. We have seen a lot of articles even right now going around. Right now, the United States is considering rehabilitating a railway line which will connect Zambia to Democratic Republic of Congo and all the way to Angola. So this railway line is for taking Africa's resources. You see, so when it comes to using Africa's resources, they want to take Africa's resources through the Gulf of Guinea and send them over to the United States in the Atlantic. And of course, we are talking about cobalt, we are talking about lithium, and we are talking about, uranium and all these other resources which are being used right now in the electric car revolution, in the electrified transport revolution. We are going to talk about here we are going to talk about the fourth and the third industrial revolution in our next bonus show. This is going to be addressed. So those who are watching us right now can stay behind and try to be part of that. We are going to address what lithium and what the third industrial revolution, electrified transport systems, what all these mean, to the current industrial revolution that we are experiencing, we are going through, and who is leading this. So there's a contest for these resources right now. So when they want these resources, what I'm trying to say is that they show that Africa is doing something wrong, so it should stop doing something wrong. It should do what they are saying. Just like, for example, when you go back to the 1960s and the 70s, they said that Africa should not invest in state enterprises, abandon them. You should do private enterprises. And even right now, when you listen to President Afwerki at this particular summit, of course, which we are going to talk about, he was telling them, because many of the people, the technocrats and all of them in the middle class, these are the majority of people who are at this particular summit. When they are talking about, they are drunk on this idea which has been pumped in their head from the West, or what they have been reading from Western, from Western books. Private sector, this is the only thing you hear them saying. Private sector this, private sector that, private sector this. The private sector has to be at the center. So President Afwerki was telling them that you guys, all these arguments you are in, private sector, public sector, all these classical arguments you are engaging in, this is not the issue. The issue is the mobilization of the resources for the benefit of your people. So you can talk the private sector all you want, but if you are bringing in the private sector from outside to occupy your lands and give them the resources, then your people are going to continue to be poor. So it is not about the private sector or the public sector. It is about ownership of the resources for your people. So the West told us in the 70s that we should sell our state enterprises and concentrate on the private sector. And so this is what was done. But what we see, what happened is that when we deindustrialized and did the so-called liberalization, that Africa lost its place in industrialization across the globe. We had a share of around 7% in the 70s, the 60s and 70s, when we had these nationalist leaders who came, and we had about 7%. We had captured about 70% of the manufacturing capacity of the world. Right now, we have only 5% of the manufacturing capacity of the world. Now, the countries which concentrated on building the public sector so that it is a complete and a strong participant, in business and resources of the country, and they balanced it. They balanced the private sector and the public sector, state ownership of certain enterprises. And then the public sector also, it will be working on this side. We have seen that they were able to skyrocket and grow rapidly, especially countries in Asia, China, Singapore, and all these, majority of them ran on state, enterprises. So the advice that has been given to Africa has been majorly wrong. And so this is the same wrong advice from the same people, the West, that is continuing today. Because in the 70s, they didn't want us to use our resources. So even today, what they are doing, they don't want Africa to use the renewable resources. They don't want us to use our resources because they think that they need our resources so that they can be able to use them in the West. And when we say finance the resources, finance what you are saying that you will give it to, you want us to go to the use of renewable resources. Now finance it. You said you would finance it with about $100 billion every year. The money is nowhere to be seen. So even at this summit, these are some of the things which, rose up. And in the And of course, in the resolutions that came out from the summit, we see that there was 4 major issues which were raised from the summit. One was the fact that Africa recognizes that, of course, Africa is the origin of humanity. And of course, it is the last frontier for climate change. But even though we want to drive our industries with clean energy, we cannot be coerced. We cannot run into it blindly and say we are going to clean energy, because in some cases, solar energy has been looked at as unreliable. Even wind energy in some cases has been looked at as unreliable. And of course, Africa needs to have a mix of energy sources for it to be able to go into its industrial revolution. And we need to develop all the hydro power stations, the hydropower sources on the African continent. And of course, that is where things like the Grand Ethiopia Renaissance Dam comes in, and then the Grand Inga Dam. But again, the same people who are pushing us and saying we should use renewable energy, Africa should go into the renewable energy, then they are taking our oil and they are taking our gas, and they want to build an oil pipeline, a gas pipeline, in the Sahel, and they are fighting against Niger so that they can be able to build a gas pipeline, even though they are fighting against an oil pipeline which is being built by Africans in the East African region, which is the East African oil pipeline. So there was a recognition of that as one of the resolutions of this summit, that Africa understands that we have to play a part because we are the origin of humanity, and this is the last frontier because this is the last place that has not been developed on the earth. But then we have to understand that we cannot just be pushed into this process. Now, there was also the recognition that the current global order is unjust. The financial institutions, they are unjust, that they deny Africa the resources it needs to build up its renewable energy capacity. When you go to borrow money, this has been said consistently by Dr. Arikana Chombori, that Africa is given loans in the IMF and the World Bank at 7%, while the United States, who already has money and who is the one who's printing this money, gets loans at 4%, and European countries at 3%. So this is an exploitative institution. So that was recognized as part of it. Now, also there was a recognition that, the global partners, the so-called global partners, of course, which will come later and criticize, they have to work with Africa in the industrialization process. Okay, of course, we know President Ruto's suggestion, which he gave at the Pan-African Parliament, that we should transfer all the manufacturing, for example, of steel to Africa. We should stop taking, a bauxite from the African continent, and let us turn it into steel in Africa using the renewable energy. Let the West finance the renewable energy resources so that we can reduce the pollution. But of course, this is not going to be done. And this is one of the things, one of the issues in which I have criticism of the African continent, of us Africans, and how we arrange this, that we cannot expect external people to finance us. And this is another issue which President Afwerki of Eritrea raised. Actually, we have to mobilize our own resources instead of waiting, that some group of people are going to come about and then give us help. And of course, we saw this, that when you look at John Kerry, when he was speaking, the commitments which the United States made, which is around $30 million, which is laughable and a joke and an insult actually to the African people, when the United States mentions that they have given $30 million to the African continent for climate adaptation. And they speak it with straight faces, like as if it is something very strong that has been given. And of course, the European Union also committed itself to some money and investment in hydrogen, in Kenya. The United Arab Emirates committed, I think, to investments of around $4.5 billion in Africa. Of course, these are not all clear. These are not clear, as you know, these summits. They are not clear. They called them pledges. They said that the total number, the total amount of money that was pledged was around $23 billion. Imagine that for the whole African continent, this is $23 billion. So this is to some extent a failure. I think this is a joke. This is completely a joke. So what we had that was sensible was the Africa Development Bank, that it has committed around $25 billion alone. That is only the Africa Development Bank. So this was not money. This was not money that was part of the pledges that were made by external people, because the African Development Bank is considered an internal body. So for it, it has dedicated about $25 billion to climate change, adaptation, agriculture, and all these, sources of energy. The president of the African Development Bank has been to Eritrea recently. I think this week he was in Eritrea trying to see how he can work with President Afwerki, and he was impressed with how President Afwerki in Eritrea, how far he has gone and all this. So there is a gap there now. And this has to do with us Africans raising our own money. Now, the other issue that was recognized in the final communique, or the declaration, the Nairobi Declaration, the Nairobi Climate Declaration, was the youth and the indigenous people, which I've already spoken about. Their concerns, the youth and the indigenous people, that when we are moving forward, we have to move with the indigenous people and the youth, and we have to be able to address their concern. We cannot just move blindly and start implementing what we are calling, climate policies, new energy policies, when we have not addressed the concerns of the youth, the women, and then the indigenous people. So all these were recognized. So briefly, that could be the overview of the summit, but a lot of speeches were given by all of them. As you know, these summits, the speeches which happen, some of them, they are like repeated speeches. It's only, few speeches, maybe sometimes it's one speech which jumps out and then captures the whole summit. Like we saw President Afwerki at the end of the day, he's the one who said something which was different from what all these people were parroting. Some of the speeches, majority of the speeches are empty. They don't mean anything, stuff like that. As you know, Western people, they speak as if, they are NGOs. They will be speaking big words, sustainability, all these. But at the end of the day, when you ask what does that mean, can you quantify that sustainability word that you're talking about? It cannot be quantified at the end of the day. So this is what we saw here, that they were almost saying the same thing, at the end of the day. And the numbers, we had to look at the numbers, what was, of course, pledged at the end of the day. And it was very minimal. And so, of course, this has a lot of lessons for us as Africans. It should teach us, or it teaches us a lot of things going forward.
Thank you very much for that overview, Kwame. As you speak, I was trying to find the video, the speech of President Isaias Afwerki, just to share with them. I will look at how many minutes it is. It's not much, but at least the beginning of it. Just a second.
Okay.
Yeah, I will share it here. Yeah, it's also on our channel. You can check it or share it with people later on. But for now, let's see. Yeah, I'm gonna put it. Oh, oops.
Of everyone, this stereotype of everyone coming and making statements, PR statements about achievements, wouldn't make any sense. Let's be focused, okay? I will not talk about our achievements in agriculture, infrastructure, energy, water, and others. That will take time, okay? Now let's be focused. occasions like this one, summits where people come, do their promotion about their achievements, and mostly PR exercise. Let's get out of this cycle, first and foremost, okay? I would like to focus on my own issue. Now people are talking about the resources of the continent, 60% of this endowment, 20% of this endowment. Why can't you mobilize your own resources rather than extend your hands for handouts and charity? Is there a way of mobilizing these resources in the continent? How do you mobilize these resources? Can you mobilize the resources of Niger that are going to Europe, uranium and what have you? What about the mineral resources of this continent? Are you mobilizing these resources for the development of the continent, for climate change? What are these resources? Everybody is talking about their achievements in their own locality, in their own national borders, without even addressing the real issues challenging this continent. Talk about the continent's challenge and try to find solutions for this challenge, okay? We're talking about climate change, you're talking about resources, you are talking about so many things. Don't divert focus on non-issues, okay? Now, do your homework, come up with a definition of your goals and objectives, strategize, go for detailed plans, and then come to mobilize resources so that you implement your programs. Otherwise, I don't want to waste your time and waste my time talking about our achievements in Eritrea.
Well, you have heard him. He's a man who can talk freely. That he
Yeah.
has no vestige of that I'm gonna get this money from France or England or something. He's free. He's totally independent, and so is the country, and so is the people. That's how
Yeah.
you
So
when you are free.
yeah. So actually, Ethiopia, Eritrea is a self, dependent. It depends on itself. It's a country which depends on itself. It doesn't borrow money. So it is the African Development Bank, for example, which just went there that they think they want to give them money. They are not asking that we want money. We want loans from the African Development Bank. But the president of the African Development Bank went there and was impressed by how far, the country has been self-dependent, self-sustainable. So he said that this country teaches us a lesson in self-sustainability and using your own resources, to develop your country. So what President Afwerki actually is talking about, is what makes sense. So the idea of coming and talking about what you are doing, like, is completely empty, like, is self-promotion, completely unconstructive, because the real issues of the continent are not being addressed. So the real issues of the continent is the resources that are flowing out of the continent. And now this is what he's meaning. Are we mobilizing these resources? Now he's saying, go back and strategize. So in this, what President Afwerki is meaning is that we have to unite. That is what he's meaning, but he's saying it subtly, that let's unite and then take responsibility of the whole continent and block off the people who are stealing Africa's resources. That is why he's talking about why are the resources in Niger? Where are the resources in Niger? Can we stop the resources in Niger, the uranium in Niger, from going to Europe? Why is it going to Europe? So this is what he's talking about. But so he was asked a question, actually. What he was being asked was, what is he doing in his country, Eritrea, to combat climate change? So that's why he said that it's useless for you people to tell you what we are doing in Ethiopia if we are not together addressing the real issues. It will be self-promotion, because we need to come together and address the real issues which are affecting the continent. So the real issues which are affecting the continent is not climate change, is not corruption. Okay, these are not the real issues that are affecting the continent. the real issues which are affecting the continent is sovereignty. It is the issues of sovereignty that our continent does not have the ability, the freedom to act with independence, with absolute independence. People are interfering in the continent, and they are using this chance of interference to take Africa's resources out. And hence, that is what he said. If you look at the speech at the later part of the speech, he's talking about all these things. He's talking about the fact that Africa's resources are being taken out. Okay, and this was actually also illustrated in the report which the United Nations, published in 2021. In that report, it was found that around $100 billion of Africa's resources are flowing out of the continent every single year. Imagine $100 billion, what it can do to this African continent. So the report on illicit financial outflows, which was published by the United Nations, showed that Africa's money actually was flowing to countries like the United States. It was flowing to Europe. These were the major places where Africa's money was flowing to. So these are the things President Afwerki was talking about. Now we need $100 billion every year to address the issue of climate change. And that is the money Europe and the United States are taking from Africa. At least according to the United Nations report on illicit financial outflows out of Africa. But Pan-Africanists themselves have estimated that the money that is flowing out of Africa is up to $250 billion. It's not just $100 billion the United Nations is saying. It's much more than that. Now, these are the people who are saying that they are giving Africa loans. So this is a huge shame. Now, this is what President Afwerki is talking about. Can we mobilize these resources and block off these people who are stealing Africa's resources? Why is Niger's uranium going to Europe? It's because of this interference. So he said that if we start putting our hands, we are waiting for handouts, and we don't mobilize these resources, we are inviting interference. He spoke about these things. We are inviting interference. This money which is given is for interference. You are inviting interference into the country, into the continent. So I think this is just a simple addressing of Africa's problems at the fundamental level. We have to address Africa's problems fundamentally, and that is the point he's trying to make. Not just to come and start talking about women's rights. It's because of the women's rights that Africa is not developing. It's because of corruption that Africa is not developing. So all these, you are crowding, these things are making you lose focus. It's because of the chicken rights. It's because the animals, they don't have rights. It's because of this and that. It's because of climate change. It's because the rivers are drying up. But all these, if you sum them up, it is because of the resources. And the only place you can address these issues is at the political level, at the leadership level. And our leadership, as you have seen on the African continent, has been captured. Our political systems have been captured by the West. You are seeing how France is behaving. Many people, of course, they will be blaming, what of Zimbabwe? But Zimbabwe cannot combat and fight against neocolonialism alone. Just like how Nkrumah would not fight against neocolonialism alone. To the point that Nkrumah, the great Nkrumah, a genius, was overthrown from power. So he could not fight it alone. That is why Nkrumah was looking for a unified Africa. Because he wanted Africa to gain strength and be able to fight back. But the single small states, that is why I pity people who are always pushing against Zimbabwe and all these things. Zimbabwe is corrupt. What? The issue is not corruption. The issue is sovereignty and power. And consequently the control over resources. This is what he is talking about, President Afwerki. The issue has to be addressed at the political level, and the current political space in Africa cannot address those issues without unifying. The power in Africa has to be compounded together. It has to be aggregated. Then this is when Africa will be able to respond. This is when Africa will be in a position to respond to all these challenges of mobilizing the resources. Now, when you start coming together as Africans, you have a single government, then you can mobilize the resources for the benefit of the people. But until that is done, we are going to stay, in the cycle, around the circles, moving around the circles. We are addressing climate change, we are addressing human rights issues, we are addressing women's rights, we are addressing this and that, and we are addressing the chicken's rights and the animal rights and all these, and we will never solve Africa's problems. So these are the issues I think that President Afwerki is trying to address.
Yeah, thank you. That was a good reflection on President Isaias Afwerki's speech there. Now, comparing the goal of this summit, which is a continuation of the one that was held in UAE, was it in Dubai? Did it achieve anything?
Yeah, but the COP27, I think COP27 was in Egypt. The one which is going to be in Dubai is the COP28. And so even the president of the United Arab Emirates invited the African leaders and all the people who were present at this particular summit, the Africa Climate Summit in Nairobi. Yes, I think that one of the biggest achievements, of course, like I mentioned, about $23 billion was mobilized in pledges. And of course, this is not money that is going to be given to Africa. And I want to make that clear. Others are saying they are going to invest their businesses. People are coming to invest their money and make profit and take it back. But of course, they present it as if they are giving it to Africa so that it can sound as if it can sound generous. But these are not people that are giving money to Africa, that it is money that is going to the African Development Bank. And then Africa is going to use it for addressing the climate project, like building farms or building solar farms or building. No, that's not how it is. This is not what it is. But they make it look as if it is something very special, which they are doing. So what I think that was achieved, before, of course, we come to some of the things we think that should have been done better, was the fact that we were able to mobilize, of course, the continent. President Ruto, as you've seen, a lot of presidents were around. Former presidents like Obasanjo was around. Haile Mariam, the former president of the former prime minister of Ethiopia was around. A lot of former, presidents were around, and presidents themselves were around. The Secretary General was around. He also gave a speech, the Secretary General. And of course, the same speech is similar to what he gave at the G20. The speech, when you look through it, is almost the same if you listen to what he spoke at the G20, how the global system needs to be changed. And of course, we addressed even this when we were talking about G20. His speeches, the fact that he comes to the global south, to the global south and talk about how the international system needs to be addressed or needs to be reformed. The international institutions which were built up during after World War II need to be reformed. Instead of staying in Washington, he should fly from New York and go to Washington and talk to Joe Biden. I mean, an old man like this comes to India and then comes to South Africa and comes to Nairobi and is telling us how these institutions should be reformed. I don't know who he expects that will reform these institutions, because it is certainly not the global south that is going to address the reformation of these institutions. I think he should talk about or talk to the people who are holding back the reformation of these institutions. He should go to the United States, go to Germany, go to France in Paris, because these are the people who are holding back the reformation of the institutions. But certainly, we saw that President Ruto was able to mobilize the African continent. It is possible Now, this shows you that it is possible to mobilize the African continent and, of course, be on the same page and strike up some resolutions and be on the same page, whether you are going to speak to the G20, like we got a seat at the G20 as the African Union. It is possible to mobilize ourselves and be on the same page as Africans and have the same goal, have the same objectives, have the same projects that we want to work on at the African Union or as the African continent. It is possible. So I think that this is one of the major achievements when it comes to the Africa Climate Summit, because of course the purpose of the summit was to integrate Africa's position and put it together when it comes, integrate Africa's position on climate change, consolidate Africa's position on climate change, so that when we go out there, we should all say the same thing. When we are at the United Nations, we should say the same thing, that the Western world has to honor its pledges, like the pledge of $100 billion every year. They have never honored this pledge which they made to the Global South. Never. They have never given money that this is a coin of what we promised. So this is a problem. This is a problem. So there's a recognition that we can mobilize our continent, even though a lot of people say, Africa is diverse and it is difficult to mobilize and stuff like that. But we saw Morocco was around, Egypt was around, or Libya was around. The president of Libya was there. All of us, almost all of us, were represented at this particular, President Idris Deby, from Chad was around. So all these guys were around. So it is possible. I think this was the major achievement for me, that if even the fact that if we speak with one voice, then the world will be able to hear us and pay us respect. But if we don't respect ourselves and we don't move purposefully as Africans, then the world will never respect us. So I think that this was the major achievement, because certainly when you look at the money that was mobilized, their pledges, they are unclear whether that money will come or not. I don't think that was an achievement, the $23 billion which they were talking about, investment in hydrogen, green hydrogen in Nairobi, and then there's some investments which will be in Burundi, and then others which will be which I don't understand. So that is not clear money, because I think that we should have some clear projects that we want these people to finance. When we went to the Paris Global Finance Pact, the new Global Finance Pact in Paris, we should have gone with particular projects. These are the projects that are related to climate change, how we want to address climate change. These are the projects we have as Africans. But I hope that this will be addressed in the future engagements. But I think our organization, Connect Africa, will get a chance to write to President Ruto about such things which we are suggesting on this channel. We will write a letter to him, and of course we will share it with our audience here. Thank you, Mahlet.
So what do you think it could have been done to make it better?
I think that we should have come with specific projects at this summit, like I mentioned. If we have a dam like the Inga Dam, because what we have learned is that
just like President Isaias said, like
yes,
it's not in the
so we have to be clear. Yes, we have to sit down and strategize and mobilize our resources. And of course, the global finance system is not favoring Africa. If you look at, I saw an article today where the African Union was saying that it's going to establish its rating agency, so that it can be able to rate the African economies, because the Western rating agencies like Fitch and all these other agencies, they have been downgrading Africa's economy and labeling them risky. They are not good for investment. So that means we have to find another way of dealing with the things. So we should come with specific projects that if the United States are coming to this particular summit, and France and the European Union, you are coming to this summit and you are talking about climate change, put down money and finance this project. If you don't want to finance, if you think you cannot finance this particular project, $100 billion, we want to build $80 billion, we want to build the Inga Dam, then please don't come here and talk about these things. Do not pass over here and start talking about these things. And there should be candid leaders, firm leaders who are willing to talk about this. If we want these things to be spoken about, give them to President Isaiah. If you, Ruto, think that you are timid, you don't want to talk about them, give them to President Isaiah. That if at the opening of the summit, like if we have another Africa Climate Summit, the second Africa Climate Summit, we have to evaluate the past performance. Now we have to review, for example, the previous pledges and whether they were fulfilled. If they were not fulfilled, we give a leader who does not fear to talk about these things. Give it to President Isaiah and tell him that if you know that you did not fulfill your pledges to Africa, please do not come and talk about climate change again. And if you know we have projects which we want to accomplish in Africa in order for us to address the issue of climate change, if you know that you are not willing to put down money and you want to give here speeches, please don't give speeches. Whether you are the United States, whether you are the European Union, whether you are who or who, please do not, whether you are the United Nations, please do not come here and talk about climate change in Africa and how Africa should address climate change, because we do not want empty talk. So I think this approach, we have to be firm in this. So these summits should be addressed with purpose, with a strong goal in mind that these are the projects which we want to build. We want to build the nuclear power plants. Africa is surrounded by water. We could build nuclear power plants all across the south, the north, major nuclear power plants. We build the Inga Dam. We could build the Inga Dam in the central part of the continent, because this is in the central, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, this Inga Falls. Now we could build nuclear power plants, about 4 major nuclear power plants, you know, in the north, the south, the east, and the west. About 4 nuclear power plants, major ones, huge ones. These could be enough to address, you know, the climate change issues. They could be enough to address, you know, climate change issues. And then when we come specifically with projects like this, then I think that it is easier for us to be purposeful and speak with one voice as Africans. The other issue is what President Isaiah Afwerki, of course, already mentioned, the fact that we need to raise money internally. So why have African governments not put down money to start addressing the issue of building the Inga Dam of $80 billion? We want to build that dam. I mean, we could start, then we could ask other people to come on board. Our economy, the African economy, is $3.5 trillion. India is addressing its own problems with the same size of economy as Africa. So can we as Africans. What is needed is purposeful mobilization, because the resources are there. We have the resources. The issue is not the lack of resources. The issue is the misuse of resources and not the mobilizing those resources. Because if we have an economy of $3.5 trillion, this makes us the 5th or the 6th biggest economy across the world. We do not need aid. We do not need to be moving with balls begging anyone. So we could start, and all these other institutions or financial institutions and groups who want to finance, they could see how serious we are. So out of the $80 billion of building the Inga Dam, the neighboring countries which are going to benefit the most could start by mobilizing. You could even start by mobilizing $20 billion. And then you go to China, and the Chinese, you tell them that we already have $20 billion. If we have $20 billion, which we have mobilized with our banks, we put our banks at the center. Africa Import and Export Bank, you know, we have the Africa Development Bank. We need to have these guys at the center, president of the Africa Development Bank, and then let him look for ways. We have some of the smartest people, we have them, economists. They could look into these issues. But there's lack of leadership, like what has been mentioned consistently. There's lack of focused, visionary leaders on the continent. And of course, that is what for us is paining us. And that is what we think that should be addressed immediately. And of course, in our small corner as Connect Africa, of course, we are working on one side, and we said we work with other organizations like Africa Continental Unity Party, which we think that everyone should belong to. We think that this party will be able to address these problems urgently. Of course, this is another topic. This is a topic for another day, and we will be able to address what the Africa Continental Unity Party is. But these are the organizations which Connect Africa is working with. And we think that this should have been the approach. We mobilize our own resources. We come with specific projects. But other than that, I think that was, that was a missed opportunity for this particular summit. So at the end of the day, there was nothing very specific that we came out with from the summit. The pledges were just pledges. They are not real thing that at the end of the day, you know that we went with maybe $20 billion that was sent or is going to be sent in a month to the African Development Bank by these people who have pledged. And you know that Europeans are good at pledging and they don't fulfill anything. Like how we have mentioned the $100 billion, which was pledged by the whole collective West, and not a single coin was given to the Global South for addressing this climate change. Yet they have the courage even to appear at the Africa Climate Summit and want to speak there. They have this courage. So they really have no shame. Thank you, Mahlet.
Thank you, Kwame, for that. Thank you very much. As usual, you delivered on the topic. Yeah, now let's go to the comments here, the questions. We give it 10 minutes, really, exactly 10 minutes. And then Kwame mentioned before, there's a bonus show where he will talk about the fourth industrial revolution. You all, we ask you kindly if you can go to, if you can continue with us to the next show. I will share the link here. But before that, let me just go. When you talked about the Dubai, the upcoming COP 28 is in Dubai, and so somebody said, was it Mikey? He said, "Oh, another shopping trip for our leader."
Yeah, you know, our African civil servants. So what is happening is that the system we are running now is completely corrupt, that it doesn't deliver on what it is supposed to. And the system is like an infrastructure. So when we talk about the system, we are talking about the political infrastructure. So China has its own political infrastructure and economic infrastructure, and that is why you are seeing that it is going forward. Now we have an economic infrastructure that is tied to the West. We have a political infrastructure that is tied to the West. That is why you see that the French think that they can determine, and they should determine who should be the president. In their former colonies, they say, put back Bazoum. We want Bazoum back. So I don't know who gave them this right that they can be able, they should be able to determine for Africa. I don't know whether they are superhuman, that they came from somewhere and they have a right to impose on Africa anything they want. But this is the political infrastructure that now we are running. And of course, we have the United States also on the other side, is supervising Africa with around 29 military bases on the African continent, which is ridiculous and should not happen. And we call for the withdrawal of the United States from Africa's soil and take it back. We would like to see the United States sending its best businessmen and industrialists to the African continent. The United States does not send its military bases to China or India. It rather sends its best businessmen and best companies. This is what we would want to see the United States doing in Africa, not sending the military bases on the African continent. We would like to see the United States and Europe sending its best manufacturing companies and businesses to the African continent to do business, not the military bases. So that is why we here as Connect Africa, we officially call for the withdrawal of the United States military infrastructure all over Africa, of the African continent. The African continent doesn't need any protection from the United States. It does not need any training from the United States. And this is coming from the voice of the African youth. We do not need these puppets that they are trying to protect. They are trying to protect their puppets who are allowing them to exploit Africa's resources. So we want to see the United States and Europe send its best businesses, its best companies, like Tesla. Tesla has never been to Africa. It has not,
Kwame,
installed.
I have to cut you because there's another question.
Yes.
And so yeah.
So this is what we want to see, and not the military bases. But that's the infrastructure. The infrastructure which we are running, it allows the United States to occupy Africa, even though the African people did not vote on this, that the United States should come here. In Ghana, where it is occupying, people demonstrated against the presence of the United States military, but it forced itself and came. And it's the same with all the other African countries, that people, they don't want to see the United States military there. So this is going to cause problems between the African people and the United States and the whole collective West, because we do not want to see the United States military and the Western military. We want to see the best companies. So that infrastructure has to be dismantled.
Yeah, so you took their minutes. You're going to be punished for that. Yeah. Yeah, somebody was mentioning, was it Get Black with me, the Pan-Africanism versus national unity. We, like most of us, talk about Pan-Africanism, but what first has to come is the national unities, and it's easier to accept Pan-Africanism, which is true. I was sharing my view. Sometimes the reverse can be also possible, that it could, some people, you see them, they are still promoting that ethnicity in their country, but again, they want to be also Pan-Africanists. They are open for Pan-Africanism then, but they don't see that the logic doesn't work. You cannot be a tribalist and then a Pan-Africanist. But when they realize, then it's easier for them to accept, that national unity is important. Also, it is a hard way to go, but it's possible. So what do you think, that Pan-Africanism coming before having the national unity?
Yeah, so we Pan-Africanism this is a complicated question.
You have 2 minutes.
So it is a question of approach. How should we approach the issue of unifying the African continent? This is not a very easy question. From Nkrumah's perspective, we had to work with the leaders who were existent during that period, during his time in the 1960s, and then find leaders who agree with the idea of Pan-Africanism, and then be able to unify the continent. But you go to people like, for example, the All Africa People Revolutionary Party, they say that you should go at the national level and organize the masses, but they do not tell you how you should organize the masses and why. Ever since Nkrumah left, they have not organized the masses to come from down. What they are talking about is the bottom up. The claim is that Nkrumah's approach was top-down approach, so that is why it failed, because the masses were not involved in the project of unifying Africa, and therefore we should come from down. And that is what I don't know who asked the question, he's talking about, that we should come from the bottom up, which is the national level. So this is the question of approach. So there's no, what I understand from my side, there's no one, one bullet for all the solution. And you say one size fits all, but you would need to approach it from a very, difficult situation. How did China unify? Are there examples of the unification process? We saw in the United States, how did they unite? The first 13 states which unified to form the United States. It was done by the political leaders. It was not done by the masses. So in China, how they unified the country after independence, it was the leaders who mobilized the masses. So you had leaders who belong to the masses, and they mobilize the masses. So these things, it is important to look at history and look at what does history say? What does history say? Looking at the countries who have done the same thing before. The Soviet Union, how was it unified, for example? The leaders came together and they unified themselves and say, we have to work for the masses. So it is either way. Leaders, you have to have purposeful leaders, and those leaders have to mobilize the people. So there's no such thing as bottom up, down up. So that is why you see that all these things, people who try to be in one box and lock themselves in one box, most of the times, when you ask them, how do you want us to do it? Can you do it? They will not show you how they want to do it. So all these are theories, but theories, like how they say, theory is supposed to be backed by practice. Just like what Nkrumah said, that action, without thought is blind, and thought without action is empty. So that means you are supposed to practice, you are supposed to take action, and then you make corrective action. So what you do informs you how to correct yourself, what is right and what is wrong. So that would be the question for me, that there's no one, there's no one size fits all, that this is how I'm going to do it. There's a fixed way of doing it. So the question of unifying Africa is a very complicated situation that has to be approached, and then you learn as you go. You try everything. There's no one way. Even when you look at the civil rights movement, I'll bring you the example of the civil rights movement. The first tactics which were used during the civil rights movement in the 1950s, they failed. And then they went back. The civil rights leaders went back to strategize again and start again. And they went back to implement, and until they found something which was working. So that idea that there is something which works, there's one formula, there's no such thing when it comes to a revolution. And that is what, of course, Africa needs. Africa needs a revolution with what is happening. And the current system has to be washed away completely. They have to be removed.
CND said Egypt signed nuclear agreements with Russia in 2019. Construction of their power plants is ongoing. Phase 1 is on schedule to be completed. In 2038? Did I get that right? The other 3 will be done by 2030. Maybe you wanted to say 2028, I'm sure. Is that so, Sandes? But yeah, so nuclear power is this. But Egypt is fighting Ethiopia not to build the dam. It's doing something else. It's a good thing that several African countries, South Africa, Egypt, Uganda, Burkina Faso, have signed agreements on building more nuclear power plants. All right then.
Yeah, they did at the Russia Africa summit. Some countries signed. In Egypt, Russia is already building some nuclear power plants there. I think South Africa also must have been on the list of reviving their nuclear power plants. They were supposed to build some nuclear power plants with Russia together with South Africa, and they were not able to do that during Jacob Zuma's presidency. But he was fought against. A lot of people fought against Jacob Zuma in that process, and those plants were not built. And right now, South Africa is facing a lot of energy problems. So people are regretting now why they fought against President Zuma. and the nuclear power plants were not built. So yes, Russia signed a couple of agreements, MOUs with countries in Africa for the building of nuclear power plants, including Uganda and Egypt. Already, they are already building. Yeah, so we'll see what will happen. We want to see when these plants are on board, or when the construction has started. We don't want to celebrate MOUs, because MOUs can be discarded anytime. Yeah. So we
True.
want to see when the building has started, and the process has started, and probably when they have started working and electricity has started coming out.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Then Mikey in the beginning, he was asking if those $100 billion promise were paid, but in the discussion, you have answered that as if you have read the question. So
No, they've
very
never,
good.
they've
So
never paid.
he was calling it a comfort to a fool, something like that. Those.
Yes, so this was actually also addressed at the Africa Climate Summit. A lot of African presidents, they spoke about it. They
Did they
spoke about the
complain?
fact,
Okay.
and even at the Paris New Global Finance Pact, which was hosted by France, a lot of African leaders spoke about it, and even at the G20 summit, it was again spoken about. These were the highlights. The fact that the West needs to honor its pledges. And of course, the Western world did not mention this in their media. They don't like mentioning this. They were just saying that the global South is demanding a lot. That is what they say.
Yeah, all right then. Thank you. That was it from us for this the discussion on this specifically, the African Climate Summit that was held in Nairobi. Now, as Kwame mentioned, we have a next show. So you all tune to that one. And thank you, Black, really, for reminding our people here to subscribe, like, and share. That's important. Ossie, he asked, maybe you will reply him, I don't know, in the comment section. How will a united Africa benefit them government? Well, okay, maybe you are asking Ossie, I think, to the previous, it's a conversation between you and somebody else, I think. Yeah. All right, then. Yeah, thank you. Let's see you on the next one, like in a minute. Okay. Thank you, Kwame. Bye-bye.